Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Lamed Aleph contains one Mishnah and three mini sugyas. The Gemara has a number of questions about the special tevilah that everybody needed to do before they came to the mikvah. The Gemara wants to know what exactly were the details of those halachas. Then the Gemara talks about the tevilah that the Kohen Gadol did. The Gemara discusses where that tevilah happened and what that tells us about the water source. Then the Gemara will bring in our next Mishnah, which actually describes the avoda, the first steps of the avoda, that the Kohen Gadol would do on Yom Kippur, which was the standard avoda that everybody did every day. The Gemara will bring a machlokas as to how many times he washed his hands before the first avoda. So the Gemara begins. The Gemara has a couple of shilas, some questions about the halacha, the special tefillah that everybody needed to do before they entered the Beis HaMikdash. And as we said, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, that was not a real tefillah d'oraisa, that was only tefillah d'rabbanan, to remind people to think about and question carefully, do they have any tum on them that they need to take care of? So the Gemara says that Abai asked of Yosef, since it's only a d'rabbanan reminder tefillah, do they have the rules of chatzitza or not? Do they have to make sure that there's nothing on their skin that's blocking the water from reaching their skin? So the Gemara says he answered, and he says, yes, every time the Rabbanan made Gzeira, they did it in the same way that it's done in d'oraisa. The tefillah, the Rabbanan will have the same rules as the tefillah d'oraisa, and therefore the rules of chatzitza do apply. Now Abai has a question. Do you have to do that tefillah if you're only coming partially into the azar? You're only sticking a limb or something into the azar. Do you have to do that tefillah or not? So he said, yes, obviously you do, because we know that the halacha is that a mitzvah only has to stick his toe and his earlobe into the Beis HaMikdash, but we've had into the azar, but we've had this whole discussion about whether he needs to do tefillah or not, assuming that he has the same halachas. It's considered to be that he's entering the Beis HaMikdash, the azara, fully, and therefore that is considered entering. Okay, now the Gemara has a shayla. What about if somebody wants to stand outside the azara and he wants to do a shechita inside the azara? That means he wants to take a very long knife, and he will keep his body fully outside the azara, but the knife will stretch through Sharnik and through the gate, and will do a shechita inside the azara. Is that okay or not? So the Gemara says this is a question according to all extremes here. According to Ben Zayma, holds that this tevilah is a mitzvah d'oraisa. I could still ask this question because this guy's not going into the actual azara, so maybe he doesn't have to do the tevilah. Even if it's a very chamer mitzvah d'oraisa, maybe he doesn't have to go in. On the other hand, maybe he does have to do tevilah, because even though he's not planning on going in, he may end up going in. Could also ask, going to the Rabbanon, that seem to say that there is no obligation for tevilah before you go into the Beis HaMikdash altogether. They say only Mitzvah needs to do tefillah, but a regular person doesn't have to do a random tefillah even if he's a tahar before he goes into the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara could still ask, because this person is doing avoda. He's not planning on going into the Beis HaMikdash, but he is actually doing an avoda. Maybe to do an avoda, you do have to do a tefillah. To just enter, you don't have to do a tefillah, but to do an avoda, you do have to do a tefillah, even though he's not actually standing inside the azara. So we could ask this question, and the Gemara leaves it unanswered. The Gemara says a teku. Okay, now the Gemara refers back to our last Mishnah, where we had said that there are 5 tevilos that the Kohen Gadol needs to do, and 10 times washing his hands. The Gemara quotes a brisa. The Gemara says there were 5 tevilos and 10 kiddushin that he needs to do on that day, and he gives the location. They all had to be performed in the Beis HaParva. That is a special mikvah which is on the roof of the Parva chamber, which was inside the Hazara, because therefore it counts as Makam Kadosh. The Torah, when it describes the tefillos and the hand washing of Yom Kippur, says that should be done in Makam Kadosh, which is in the Hazara. The one exception is the first tefillah for the day. That was the same tefillah that everybody had to do. That wasn't special to Yom Kippur or Yom Kippur Avoda. It was a classic tefillah that everybody needed to do before entering the Hazara, and therefore that didn't have to be done in Makam Kadosh. That was done on top of the Shar HaMayim, on top of the gate called Shar HaMayim, which is on the southern wall of the Hazara. Says Abaye, so now you see from this that the water source of that mikvah on top of Shar HaMayim, which was called Ein Eitam, which Rashi says is the same as Ein Niftoach, Mein Niftoach, which is mentioned in Sefer Yehoshua. So that spring must be at least 23 amos higher than the floor of the Azara. How so? Because the gate of Shar HaMayim was at least 20 amos high. Like we have a mission that says all the gates and all the walls in the Beis HaMikdash were 20 amos high, except for the Heichel. Heichel was 40 amos high. So it was 20 amos high. Now the mikveh itself has to be at least 3 amos high, because we know that the minimum size of a mikveh is 3 amos by 1 amma by 1 amma. That's learned from the fact that it says V'rochatz b'sar b'mayim. So b'mayim means it has to be water that covers his entire body. It has to be mei mikvah, and it has to be water that covers his entire body. And Chazal say that that's 3 amos by 1 amma by 1 amma. So it has to be 3 amas high. And therefore you have 23 amas total. Now the water couldn't flow upwards from the Ein Eitam spring to get into that mikvah. Got to flow downwards, and therefore it has to be at least 23 amas high. The Gemara says, but you're leaving something out. What about the floor? What about the roof of the gate and the floor of the mikvah? You probably had an amma thick roof of the gate, like everything. You need an amma thickness, and you also had to have a floor that was a thick layer of clay and cement in order to keep the water of the mikvah from seeping through. So you have another 2 amas. He says, no, the floor was made out of marble, and marble is non-porous, and it's very well sealed, and it's also very strong, and therefore you didn't need more than just a little bit. You didn't have to have an entire amma thickness. He says, okay, so you have to have that little bit. At least it has to be higher than the 23 amas. He says, yeah, Abaye rounded it off. He was rounding it off to the nearest amma, but it was a little bit more than 23 amas. Okay, now in our Mishnah, we'd also seen that they spread a sheet of linen to give the Kohen Gadol privacy. People shouldn't see him when he's undressing to go into the mikvah. So he says, why was it a linen sheet? Rav Kahana explains, because he's doing all his avodas, he's doing many avodas that day wearing linen garments, which he doesn't usually wear. We want him to keep that in mind when he's going to the mikvah, and that's why we hung up that linen sheet. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah, and the Mishnah describes the actual avoda as it began. So the Mishnah says that he undressed, he went down to the mikvah, came out of the mikvah, dried himself off with a towel. They brought him the golden regular Kohen Gadol clothing, he put them on and washed his hands and feet. Then they brought him the carbon Tamid. He cut the neck of the carbon Tamid. Somebody else finished the shechita because he had to quickly catch the blood. He had to do all the avodah, so he had to switch from cutting to catching. So he caught the blood, and he went and he put the blood on the wall of the mizbeach. Then he took a break from the carbon Tamid. He went to do the ketores and to clean and prepare the lamps in the menorah. Then he went back to the carbon Tamid and he put the head and the parts on the mizbeach. Then he brought the minchas chavitin, which is brought every day with the carbon and talmid. Then he did the nesachim, the wine that goes together with the carbon and talmid, and that's what he did. Now the Mishnah sums this up a little bit and says that the ketores of the morning was brought between the blood and the limbs of the carbon tamid of the morning, like we've just seen. And then the Mishnah says in the afternoon, the ketores was brought between the limbs and the nesachim. It wasn't brought between the blood and the limbs. The sacrificing of the blood of the limbs was brought between the placing of the limbs in the mizbeach and the putting of the wine, nesachim. That's where it was interposed between step 2 and 3 of the carbon tamid hakrava, not between step 1 and 2. Now the Mishnah adds, as far as the tefillah and the mikvah, which we mentioned before, if the Kohen Gadol was old or fragile, and therefore he couldn't stand the cold water, they would pour in hot water in order that it shouldn't be so cold for him. Okay, now the Gemara discusses a conversation that Rav Papa had with his Talmidim, and the Talmidim want to say that this mission doesn't fit with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Now there's a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, and that's the Rabbi Meir we're referring to here. The machlokes between the Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is how and what state did the Kohen Gadol wash his hands when he changed. That we're not referring to the first hand washing, we're referring to between the first set of clothing and the second set of clothing, when he changed from the first set to the second set. So everybody agrees he has to wash his hands twice. The question is, what is the order exactly? According to Rabbi Meir, he would first take off the first clothing, and while undressed he would wash his hands, put on the second set of clothing, then wash his hands the second time. According to the Chachamim, no, he would wash his hands first while he's dressed, then change clothing, and then wash his hands while he's dressed in the second set. So Gemara says that the Talmidim wanted to claim that the argument between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is as follows. What is the two hand washings for? According to the Chachamim, one hand washing is on the old clothing you're taking off, and that's why you washed your hands before you took them off, and the other hand washing is on the new clothing that you're putting on. Now, according to that, I understand why when he puts on his first set of clothing, he only washes his hands once, like it says in our Mishnah here. He's not taking anything off. So therefore, only when he's putting on his new clothing, he has to wash his hands one time for that. According to Rabbi Yehuda, however, that he's washing his hands twice, and first he takes off the old clothing, and then he washes his hands, then he puts on the new clothing, then he washes his hands again. That sounds like both washings are in preparation for the new clothing. Putting on new clothing requires 2 hand washings, not any for the old one, 2 for the new one. If that's the case, then when he puts on his first set of clothing, like our Mishnah is describing, he should do 2 hand washings. 1 before he puts on the clothing, and 1 after he puts on the clothing. So how come the Mishnah doesn't say 2? Obviously, it doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir. So Gemara says, Rabbi Papa rejected their argument. He said, no, it's not correct. Rabbi Meir himself would agree that you only do 1 washing in the beginning. And then his machlokes with the Chacham is about something else entirely. he agrees that both washings, that there's one washing each for taking clothing off and for putting the clothing on. The reason why you wash your hands twice, like the Chachamim said, between the first clothing and the second set is once for the clothing you're taking off and once for the clothing that you're putting on, and therefore in our Mishnah he would agree that since you're only putting clothing on, you're not taking off any big kodesh at all, you only have to wash your hands once. However, why does he disagree with them and say that the first washing is after you take the old set of clothing off? So it's a question of how you read the psukim. The psukim say pashat v'rachatz v'lavash. It says he takes off, he washes, and he dresses. So you see a connection between the washing and the dressing. So Rabbi Meir says it's as follows: the washing the second set of washing takes place after he puts the clothing on. The first set of washing takes place after he takes the clothing off. Both situations, the washing goes after the clothing activity that he did. Again, he agrees that the first washing is on the old clothing and the second washing is on the new clothing. And he says you connect the two, that both of them are after the clothing activity. So the old clothing he takes off, then he washes. The new clothing he puts on, and then he washes. The Chachamim say, no, you make the connection differently. The relationship, there is a relationship between the two, but it's not like what you said. It's both of them he washes when he's dressed. Just like he's going to wash his hands after he puts on the new clothing and he'll be dressed. So he washes his hands before he takes off the old clothing and he'll be dressed, and that's why they argue and say that the first washing has to be before he takes the old clothing off. But therefore, Apap is saying that everybody really agrees that there is one set of washing on the old clothing, one set of washing on the new clothing, and therefore before the first set, you'll only wash once, and Rav Meir fits in our Mishnah, it says you only wash once. So the Talmidim retorted, and he says, it's not true, we have a Brisa that clearly quotes in Machokas between Rav Meir and the Chachamim whether he does one washing or two washings before the first set. And Rav Meir clearly says you have to first get undressed, wash your hands, go to the mikvah, come out, get dressed, and then wash your hands again. So before the first set, Rav Meir does say you wash twice. So Rav Papa says, look, if you have an explicit brisa, so that I'm not going to argue on it, and if that's what he taka holds, and then it really doesn't fit with our Mishnah over here. Now, the Gemara just says a kasha, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, I understand that there are 10 washings. Because every time you put the clothing on, and you have to put on 5 clothing sets, you have to wash your hands twice, so there are 10 washings. According to the Chachamim, however, it should be only 9 washings, because the first time you're only going to wash once. So the Gemara says, yeah, but the Chachamim say that you wash it whenever you take something off. So they will have another washing after you take off the last set of clothing before he gets dressed in his street clothes that Rabbi Yehuda will not have, and that'll add up, therefore, to 10 washings.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.